Well, MPs are heading back to Canberra today for what promises to be a fiery start to the parliamentary year. While leadership speculation has, of course, dogged the government, Labor's primary vote is actually up 4 points to 33% in the latest Fairfax Nielsen poll.
Labor MP Andrew Leigh is the federal member for Fraser in the ACT, and he joins us from Canberra. And Kelly O'Dwyer is the Liberal MP for the Victorian seat of Higgins and is here with us in the studio. Good morning. We'll actually start.
Hi, how are you?
Let's actually start with Andrew Leigh in Canberra. What do you make of the latest Nielsen results?
Well, Karina, I don't pay any attention to polls. Actually, when I was a former professor at ANU, I did some work looking at the predictive power of polls in the next election, and they have absolutely none. I think politicians and maybe even commentators who spend their time focusing on polls are wasting space that could be devoted to bigger issues, to thinking about how we build a stronger Australian economy, how we deliver infrastructure, and how we put in place the education framework that will allow Australia to compete in the 21st century. All of these are much bigger issues than whether a particular poll is going up or down from statistical noise on a given day.
Really? You're not prepared to give the Prime Minister credit for overtaking Tony Abbott as preferred Prime Minister, Andrew Leigh?
Michael, there's just no point. You can get caught up on these polls, and we see them coming with increasing frequency. So in the US, they're now coming out daily. Can you imagine if every day we woke up and talked about polls instead of talking about what we need to do to build a better nation? I'm really focused on the fact that we're going to be delivering a surplus this year, that the Labor government has saved 200,000 jobs during the global downturn, and that we're listening to economists and putting a price on carbon pollution. All of those are big, important reform for our generation, the generations to come. They're the kinds of things that get me up in the morning.
OK, now Kelly O'Dwyer, what's your reaction to the poll? A bit of good news for Labor and pretty bad news on every front for the Coalition and Tony Abbott.
Well, I don't agree with you on that, Michael. I mean, polls go up and polls go down, and I would agree with Andrew Leigh that you can't read too much into the polls. But the one thing, of course, that the polls don't disguise is the fact that Julia Gillard and her government is completely in disarray. The very fact that she needed to call a crisis meeting to bring together her whole caucus in the lead-up to Parliament, with 20 of them, of course, missing, is a demonstration that her leadership is under real strain. And this government is distracted by the leadership question, because Kevin Rudd has been stalking Julia Gillard throughout the last year and will continue to stalk her until this question is resolved.
Let's be fair on the people missing, though. We have people like Martin Ferguson, who was at a family member's wedding. We had Stephen Smith, who was returning from that very important NATO conference overseas.
Well, of course, that's a handful of people,
There are not
Michael.
ulterior motives in every case.
That's a handful. We're talking about 20. 20 is a pretty significant number. Now, what does that reveal? I'd ask them, Michael, why they weren't there, because, of course, while some of them might have a pretty legitimate excuse as to why they weren't there, a number of them clearly thought there was no point in showing up, and a number of them perhaps were sending a message to the Prime Minister exactly what they think about her leadership and where this government's going.
Kelly O'Dwyer, one of the things that we've seen that's happened in the last few poll results is the coalition cementing its lead, but Tony Abbott falling away in the preferred Prime Minister. How do you explain that disparity?
Well, of course, as I said, polls go up and polls go down, but there is one thing that has been consistent, and that is that the Liberal Party, the Coalition, has been the only party talking about the issues that are important to all Australians. We're not obsessed with ourselves, we're obsessed with the issues that are important to the people of Australia. We have been talking about the fact that we need to reduce debts and deficits. We need to make sure we bring spending under control. There needs to be a proper national infrastructure plan. There needs to be proper cost-benefit analysis before you introduce something like a $50 billion NBN. You need to make sure that you stop the waste and mismanagement. We've spent $1 billion on pink bats and $1 billion, of course, to remove them. Over $16 billion has been spent on school halls. Much of that money, of course, has been misused and overspent. This government gets every issue wrong. This is a government, as I said, in disarray.
OK, Andrew Leigh, let's get to some of those issues now as we move into the first week of the parliamentary year. What issues do you hope will see Labor's momentum reversed and actually increase?
Well, I think one of the big challenges for this year will be building a stronger economy. And one of the things we've got here in Australia is the unique position of having a AAA credit rating from the three big credit agencies, something we didn't have when the Howard government left office. And we've got lower inflation and lower interest rates, and we've got lower income taxes when the Howard government left office. This year we'll be looking at putting in place a minerals resource rent tax, a profits-based tax that will see Australians get a fair share for the minerals that are their birthright. But on the other side, unfortunately, we've seen Tony Abbott last week really back away from the promised income tax cuts he was going to deliver. It's very clear now that under an Abbott government, the only people who would get tax cuts are big miners and big polluters. We're frankly working to stop Tony Abbott getting elected and to put in place the key economic reforms that will underpin prosperity. Extending the HECS system to vocational training is really important because it takes away the upfront costs that can stand in the way of undertaking vocational education for a young Australian. And we know that as technological change picks up, having those skills is going to be critically important in the new economy. The one thing we know about the labour market of the future is it's going to look a whole lot different from the labour market today, and so we do need to invest in skills, and we've doubled school spending as a way of doing that.
Kelly O'Dwyer, let's get to that issue of tax cuts. Tony Abbott was rather ambiguous at his press club address last week. Will the Coalition commit to those tax cuts, income tax cuts associated with the carbon tax, which of course the Coalition government has pledged to get rid of?
Well, of course, the tax cuts that Andrew Lee's spoken about are the tax cuts that we announced when we were in government, that they then delivered after they came into government. They haven't introduced one tax cut of their own. In fact, there have been 19 new or increased taxes as a result of this government. Tony Abbott quite rightly pointed out in his press club address that this is a government that wants it to tax its way out of prosperity. I mean, it just makes absolutely no sense. We are the only government that has got a record of achievement. We are the only people who have been able to deliver strong surpluses. If you want to compare records, as Andrew Lee wants to do, you look at the fact that when we left government, there was a $20 billion surplus. Now, of course, they've had four deficits. The accumulated deficits, of course, reach $167 billion. We had $70 billion. Well, Andrew, I didn't interrupt you. We had $70 billion of net assets, and this government has got, a net debt of $133 billion. That's $6,000 for every man, woman and child. This government has got a terrible record when it comes to economic management, and it doesn't matter what spin Andrew Lee would like to put on it, but the facts speak for themselves.
Are we going to see a changing of Tony Abbott's attitude? One of the key criticisms of him in the past has been the no, very anti anything that the government suggests. Is that going to change? Are we going to see a more positive agenda from Tony Abbott this year?
Well, of course, Karina, that's the Labor line. I mean, Labor would like to pretend, of course, that the opposition is nothing but negative, but it's very hard to be positive about a government that has so mismanaged the Australian economy and so mismanaged every single policy that they have brought in. When I said before that we've seen, $1 billion spent on pink bats and $1 billion to remove them, I mean, this is pretty serious stuff. And all of these mistakes add up. Today we saw reports in the paper about Warwick McKibben, a former governor of the Reserve Bank, saying that we are like the European model now with a time lag. Now, that is a very serious warning, and this government is contributing to making those mistakes that will add up over time, that will mean we have structural deficits that will make an impact for generations to come.
OK, our time is short. Andrew Lee, finally an opportunity for you to respond there.
Well, Warwick was my last boss before I entered Parliament, so I think I know a little bit about his views. He and I would disagree on some things,
clear,
but we would certainly agree on the fundamentals that Australia has low unemployment, we have very low debt by international standards, and we do not benefit from an opposition that is fear-mongering and constantly talking down the Australian economy. It is really important that we put in place those long-term investments. Ours is a government that has doubled road spending, increased rail spending tenfold.
You're good at
and is putting
spending.
in place the national broadband network, which is going to be critical infrastructure to ensure that the Australian information economy of the future is able to operate. And let me quickly knock on the head something Kelly said earlier in the interview. Yes, it is true that some Labor MPs were not at the meeting yesterday. I think you'll find that's true of pretty much any party meeting on any side of politics. These things get beaten up and they're a distraction from the real economic challenges that Australia faces. How to make the most of our future in an Asian century in which growth will come now from China much more than from the developed countries where it's come in the past.
Our time is short. I just have one more question to you. We're about to start the parliamentary session. Will Julia Gillard still be Prime Minister at the end of it?
Absolutely.
Do you support her, Andrew?
Of course.
Does she have your unequivocal support?
Julia Gillard will lead us to the next election and she will win the next election.
You didn't say that you
we are the
supported her,
party
though.
with an optimistic message for the, for the Australian people. We're not scaremongering, fearmongering and engaging in personal attacks.
It's not unequivocal,
We're focusing
Andrew.
on building the future.
I need a speaker's gavel here to shout order, order. Andrew Lee in Canberra, thank you, and Kelly O'Dwyer from Melbourne. Thanks very much for your time this morning.
Thanks a lot. Thanks,
Thank
Karina.
you.
Thanks, Michael.
All right, coming up on